Italian Alps, 1944. A black U.S. Army corporal serving in a segregated unit during the final, brutal push against German forces was reported. Killed in action. Lost heroically during a sudden, violent blizzard. His family received a medal and a neatly folded flag. For 50 years, that was the story. Then, in 1994, due to unprecedented glacial melt, an Italian farmer stumbled upon a perfectly preserved soldier emerging from the ice, his uniform intact, his personal effects untouched by time. The body was identified as Corporal Marcus Hayes. His grandson, a military historian haunted by inconsistencies in the official Kia report, flew to Italy. There, he learned the chilling truth. His grandfather hadn't succumbed to the cold. Evidence found on the preserved body and in a hidden journal pointed to a fatal encounter, a racially motivated act orchestrated by his commanding officer, and a 50-year cover-up conceived in the blinding chaos of a mountain storm. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear this. Stories like this, stories buried by time, war, and prejudice, often remain untold. They only surface because people like you choose to listen. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're joining from and what time it is where you are. Your presence, bearing witness to Corporal Hayes' long journey home, matters. Now, let me tell you the story. The winter of 1944 clawed at the Italian Alps with a vicious, indifferent brutality. For the men of the U.S. Army's 92nd Infantry Division, the famed Buffalo Soldiers, a segregated unit fighting a two-front war against both the German forces entrenched in the mountains and the pervasive racism within their own military structure. Every day was a battle for survival. The enemy was cunning, the terrain treacherous, and the cold was a constant, gnawing presence that seeped into their bones, more relentless than any artillery barrage. Corporal Marcus Hayes, a 24-year-old from Birmingham, Alabama, navigated this brutal landscape with a quiet, observant intelligence. He was not a natural soldier in the traditional sense. He was a scholar drafted into conflict, a man who preferred the weight of a book to the heft of a rifle. Before the war, he had been studying history at Tuskegee Institute, his sharp mind fascinated by the intricate patterns of the past. Now, he found himself a reluctant participant in history's most devastating chapter, his meticulous nature finding an outlet in keeping detailed patrol logs and, more privately, a small, leather-bound journal where he recorded his observations, his fears, and the stark realities of life as a black soldier in a white man's war. He was respected within his platoon, known for his calm under fire and his principled, almost stubborn, adherence to doing what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. He saw the war not just as a fight against fascism abroad, but as a fight for dignity and equality, a chance to prove, yet again, the worth and bravery of black men in service to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. His commanding officer was Lieutenant Davis, a young, ambitious white officer from a privileged background, perhaps Georgia or South Carolina, judging by his accent. Davis wore his authority like an ill-fitting uniform. His leadership characterized less by competence and more by a rigid adherence to the chain of command and a barely concealed contempt for the black soldiers under his command. He saw them not as individuals, but as interchangeable parts in the vast military machine, expendable assets in his own quest for battlefield glory and promotion. His interactions with Corporal Hayes were particularly fraught. He seemed to resent Hayes's quiet intelligence, his natural leadership, interpreting the corporal's thoughtful questions as insubordination, his principled stands as insolence. The tension between the two men was a low, constant hum beneath the roar of the war, an invisible fault line in the already fractured landscape of their segregated unit. As the brutal mountain winter dragged on, conditions worsened. Supply lines were stretched thin, frostbite was rampant, and the fighting against the entrenched German positions was a slow, bloody yard-by-yard struggle. Morale was low, particularly among the black troops, who often felt they were given the most dangerous assignments with the least adequate support. It was in this crucible of cold, fear, and simmering racial tension that Corporal Hayes began to notice something deeply unsettling, a pattern that went beyond simple mismanagement, something that smelled of deliberate, calculated malice. The cold was their most constant enemy, more insidious than German patrols. It found its way through worn boot leather, threadbare gloves, and inadequate shelters dug into the frozen mountainside. Frostbite was a daily reality, turning fingers and toes into numb, useless appendages, sometimes leading to infection, amputation, or worse. Sickness spread easily in the close, damp quarters: pneumonia, trench foot, dysentery. In this environment, access to proper medical supplies was not a matter of comfort, but of life and death. Corporal Marcus Hayes, with his keen eye for detail and his deep sense of responsibility for the men under his command, began to notice a disturbing discrepancy. While the white officers and their support staff seemed relatively well supplied, the basic necessities for the black enlisted men were often scarce, delayed, or simply non-existent. He saw men shivering through the nights with blankets that were thin and full of holes. He saw minor wounds become dangerously infected for lack of basic antiseptics. And most alarmingly, he saw men suffering from severe pneumonia or other infections being treated with aspirin and wishful thinking, while rumors circulated of vital, life-saving drugs being available just a few hundred yards away. In the officers' field station, the most critical shortages seemed to involve two specific items: penicillin, the miracle drug that could halt deadly infections in their tracks, and morphine syrettes, essential for managing the unbearable pain of battlefield injuries. Hayes had witnessed men die slow, agonizing deaths from infected shrapnel wounds, deaths he suspected could have been prevented if penicillin had been available. He had seen medics forced to make impossible choices, rationing precious few doses of morphine among grievously wounded soldiers. At first, he attributed the shortages to the general chaos of war, the notoriously difficult supply lines in the mountainous terrain. War was hell, and deprivation was a part of that hell. But as the weeks wore on, the pattern became too consistent, too targeted, to be mere coincidence. He would hear reports from supply clerks about shipments arriving at the main depot, shipments that included ample quantities of the very supplies that never seemed to make it to his platoon's aid station. He would see Lieutenant Davis and his favored sergeants looking surprisingly healthy, their cheeks ruddy while Hayes's own men grew gaunt and pale. He started asking quiet, careful questions, first among the medics in his unit, then among the supply clerks he knew from back home. He learned that official requests for penicillin and morphine submitted by the black unit's medical staff were frequently delayed, reduced, or outright denied by Davis's command post, citing limited availability or strategic reallocation. Yet, somehow, supplies for the white officers' mess or minor ailments seemed readily available. The pattern of neglect was too stark, too deliberate. This wasn't just the friction of war. It felt like something calculated, something deeply rooted in the racist indifference that permeated their segregated reality. Hayes felt a cold, slow-burning anger ignite within him. Men were suffering, dying, not just because of enemy action, but because of a system that seemed to value their lives less, a system overseen by a man who held their fates in his careless, contemptuous hands. His scholar's mind, trained to seek evidence and uncover truth, began to formulate a plan. He had to know for sure. He had to find the proof. Corporal Hayes knew that challenging a white officer, especially one as vindictive as Lieutenant Davis, was a perilous undertaking. Accusations without irrefutable proof would be dismissed as insubordination or worse. He needed evidence, cold, hard facts that could not be denied or explained away. His investigation had to be discreet, conducted in the shadows, utilizing the quiet moments between patrols and the relationships he had cultivated within the unit. His focus narrowed on the supply chain. How did vital medicines like penicillin and morphine move from the main divisional depot to the frontline units? Who signed for them? Where were the records kept? He used his off-duty hours, precious moments of potential rest, to talk to supply personnel, piecing together the bureaucratic puzzle. He learned that each company headquarters, including Lieutenant Davis's command post, maintained its own detailed ledgers, tracking the requisition and dispersal of critical supplies. Accessing those ledgers seemed impossible. His break came through an unexpected ally, Sergeant Miller, an older, weary white NCO who worked in Davis's supply tent. Miller was a career soldier, a man who believed in the Army's ideals even as he recognized its flaws. He disliked Davis's arrogance and his blatant racism, and he had developed a quiet respect for Corporal Hayes's competence and integrity. Hayes approached Miller cautiously, framing his inquiry not as an accusation, but as a concern about efficiency and the well-being of all the troops. Miller listened, his expression guarded. He knew about the shortages. He knew about the rumors. He also knew the risks of crossing Lieutenant Davis. But Hayes's quiet, principled determination struck a chord. After a long, tense silence, Miller gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Tonight," he murmured. "After midnight chow. Davis is heading to Battalion HQ. You'll have maybe 15-20 minutes. Don't get caught, Corporal." That night, under the cover of a moonless, freezing darkness, Hayes slipped away from his platoon's bivouac area and made his way to Davis's command post, a larger tent dug into the side of the mountain. Sergeant Miller was waiting, his face barely visible in the dim glow of a single lantern. He simply pointed towards a locked wooden footlocker tucked under a field desk. "The medical supply ledgers are in there. Keys on Davis's desk, under the blotter. Hurry." Miller then melted back into the shadows, his complicity sealed by silence. Hayes's hands were numb with cold, but his mind was sharp, focused. He found the key, unlocked the footlocker, and lifted the heavy lid. Inside were several canvas-bound ledgers. He quickly found the one labeled Medical, Restricted. His heart pounded as he flipped through the pages, his small flashlight beam illuminating the neat columns of dates, quantities, and signatures. And there it was. Page after page documenting large quantities of penicillin and morphine being requisitioned by Davis's office from the main depot. But the dispersal records showed only a fraction of those supplies ever reaching the aid stations of the black platoons. Huge amounts were unaccounted for, marked vaguely as damaged in transit or expired stock, disposed. It was a lie, a blatant, systematic lie documented in the lieutenant's own meticulous records. Hayes knew he couldn't take the ledger. He needed proof he could carry. Working quickly, his fingers stiff with cold, he carefully tore out 3 key pages. Pages showing massive discrepancies. Pages with Davis's signature clearly visible. It was a huge risk, damaging official records, but it was the only way. He tucked the folded pages deep inside his uniform, relocked the footlocker, replaced the key, and slipped back out into the freezing darkness. His heart pounding not just with fear, but with the grim satisfaction of holding the truth, the undeniable, documented proof of Lieutenant Davis's crime. Corporal Hayes spent the next 24 hours wrestling with his conscience and his fear. He held the proof, the damning pages torn from Davis's own ledger. But what should he do with it? Going through official channels, reporting his findings to the battalion command, seemed futile. He was a black corporal, accusing a white lieutenant in a segregated army fighting a war. He knew whose word would carry more weight. His accusation would likely be buried, dismissed, and he would face severe repercussions for his actions, stealing official records, making false accusations against a superior officer. Yet, the faces of his men haunted him. The soldier shivering with fever who could have been saved by penicillin, the young private whose mangled leg might have been less agonizing with adequate morphine. He couldn't stay silent. He had a duty, not just as a soldier, but as a man, to confront the injustice directly. He decided on a course of action that was both incredibly brave and potentially suicidal. He would confront Lieutenant Davis himself. He requested a private meeting, citing a need to discuss urgent platoon supply matters. Davis granted the request, with barely concealed annoyance, summoning Hayes to his command tent late the following afternoon. The air inside the tent was thick with the smell of kerosene from the heater and stale cigar smoke. Davis sat behind his field desk, cleaning his service pistol, his expression a mixture of boredom and impatience. "All right, Corporal," Davis said without looking up, his voice sharp. "What's so damned urgent it couldn't wait for morning report?" Hayes stood at attention, his heart pounding, the folded ledger pages feeling like a block of ice against his chest. "Sir," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, It's regarding the medical supplies, specifically the penicillin and morphine. Davis finally looked up, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of something. Caution, perhaps, entering his gaze. What about them, Hayes? Supplies are tight. It's a war. Yes, sir. Hayes continued, meeting the lieutenant's cold stare. But according to the main depot manifests, sufficient quantities have been arriving. Yet they are not reaching our aid stations. Men are suffering, sir. Dying unnecessarily. Davis placed his pistol carefully on the desk. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. Are you making an accusation, Corporal? Hayes knew there was no turning back. He reached inside his jacket and slowly, deliberately, placed the 3 torn ledger pages on the desk in front of Davis. I believe these records show a discrepancy, sir, he said quietly. Large amounts of critical medicines, signed for by this office, are unaccounted for. Davis stared at the pages, his face draining of color, the smile vanishing, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He looked up at Hayes, his eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and panic. You went through my private records? He hissed, his voice trembling with rage. You stole official documents? I sought the truth, sir, Hayes replied, standing his ground. Davis slammed his fist on the desk, the sound making Hayes flinch. The truth? Davis spat, his voice laced with venom. The truth is, you uppity Negroes are never satisfied. Always complaining, always wanting more. You think you deserve the same treatment as white soldiers? You're lucky we let you fight at all. His racism, usually kept just below the surface, now poured out, raw and ugly. He stood up, leaning menacingly over the desk. You think you're smart, Hayes. You think you can bring me down. You just signed your own death warrant. You will give me those pages, and you will forget this ever happened. Or I guarantee you, Corporal, you will regret it for the rest of your very short life. The confrontation was over. The lines were drawn. Hayes had the truth, but Davis had the power. And in the brutal calculus of war and prejudice, Hayes knew which one usually won. The air outside the command tent felt colder, sharper, after the confrontation with Lieutenant Davis. Hayes walked back towards his platoon's area, the lieutenant's final, venomous threat echoing in his ears. He knew he was a marked man. He had underestimated Davis's ruthlessness, overestimated the power of the truth in a system built on lies and inequality. He felt a profound sense of dread, a certainty that retribution would be swift and merciless. He didn't have to wait long. Later that evening, as the sky began to darken ominously and the wind picked up, whipping snow across the rocky terrain, a runner arrived with a message. Corporal Hayes was to report to Lieutenant Davis immediately. Hayes found Davis standing outside the command tent, peering up at the rapidly deteriorating weather. The wind howled through the mountain pass, driving pellets of ice horizontally. Visibility was dropping rapidly. A full-blown blizzard was descending upon them, a white curtain falling across the already treacherous landscape. Corporal, Davis said, his tone clipped. Professional, all trace of the previous day's fury carefully masked. He held out a map. Intelligence reports indicate a possible German machine gun nest on that ridge. He pointed to a high, exposed position several miles away, deep into territory that was only intermittently controlled. We need visual confirmation before morning maneuvers. I need someone reliable, someone experienced, to conduct a solo reconnaissance mission. Immediately, Hayes stared at the map, then up at the swirling, blinding snow. It was suicide. No sane commander would send a single man out in these conditions, into that terrain. Even a full squad would likely be lost. This wasn't a military order. It was a death sentence, delivered with the cold, plausible deniability of wartime necessity. Sir, Hayes began, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. With all due respect, the storm, visibility is near zero. No one could reach that ridge and return before morning. It's not a feasible mission. Davis turned to him, his eyes cold, flat, devoid of any emotion. Are you refusing a direct order, Corporal? Hayes knew he was trapped. Refusing the order would mean immediate court-martial, insubordination in the face of the enemy. a charge that could carry the ultimate penalty. Following the order meant almost certain death in the blizzard, or perhaps at the hands of the enemy, or worse. "No, sir," Hayes said, his voice barely a whisper, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Good," Davis said, clapping him lightly on the shoulder, a gesture of false camaraderie that made Hayes's skin crawl. "I knew I could count on you, Hayes. You're a credit to your race. Now, gear up and move out." "And Corporal?" Davis paused, his voice dropping slightly. "Be careful out there. It's dangerous." The final words were delivered with a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Hayes saluted, turned, and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. He was walking towards the storm, towards the impossible ridge, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the freezing wind, that the real danger was not the blizzard or the Germans. It was the man he was leaving behind. The mission wasn't reconnaissance. It was elimination. Returning to the relative shelter of his platoon's dugout, Corporal Hayes moved with a quiet, deliberate urgency. There was no time for goodbyes, no time for explanations to his men. He simply gathered his essential gear, his rifle, extra ammunition, rations, a compass, and his worn oilcloth pouch containing his journal. He knew, with a grim certainty, that this journal, his private record of the truth, was now the most important possession he owned. It was his only weapon against the lie that Davis was constructing around him. He found a small, relatively dry corner of the dugout, lit only by the flickering flame of a single candle. His fingers were stiff with cold, clumsy, but he carefully untied the pouch and opened the small, leather-bound journal. He turned to the next blank page, uncapped his fountain pen, a small luxury he guarded carefully, and began to write. His handwriting, usually neat and precise, was now hurried, slightly shaky, the script of a man writing against time, against the rising howl of the storm outside. He didn't write of fear or of anger. He wrote the facts, the historian documenting his own final chapter. He detailed the confrontation with Lieutenant Davis, recounting the lieutenant's furious denial and his explicit, racist threats. He described the impossible reconnaissance mission he had just been ordered to undertake, stating plainly his belief that it was not a legitimate military order, but a deliberate setup. "He knows I have the proof," he wrote, the pen scratching urgently across the page. "The ledger pages showing the stolen penicillin and morphine, medicines our men desperately need. He knows I won't stay silent. He tried to intimidate me, threatened me directly." He paused, listening to the roar of the wind outside, a sound that seemed to be calling his name. He dipped his pen back in the small ink bottle, his movements economical, precise. "Now, he has ordered me on a solo patrol deep into enemy territory, into the teeth of this blizzard. Visibility is 0. The temperature is plummeting. No man could survive this mission, let alone accomplish it. Sergeant Miller tried to intervene, quietly told me Davis was out of his mind, but the order stands." He underlined the next sentence twice, a final, emphatic declaration for whoever might one day read these words. "This isn't a mission, it's a trap." He signed his name, Corporal Marcus Hayes, followed by the date and the approximate time. He blotted the ink carefully, closed the journal, and slipped it back into the waterproof oilcloth pouch, securing the ties with numb fingers. He tucked the pouch deep inside his field jacket, placing it over his heart, a final, silent act of self-preservation. He stood up, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and took one last look around the dugout, at the sleeping forms of his men whose lives he had tried, and perhaps failed, to protect. Then, he turned and stepped out into the blinding, howling chaos of the blizzard, a lone figure walking into the white, indifferent maw of the storm, carrying the truth buttoned tight against his chest. The world outside the dugout was a maelstrom of white. The blizzard hit Corporal Hayes with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath, blinding him instantly. The wind screamed like a banshee, driving snow horizontally, stinging his exposed skin like 1,000 icy needles. Visibility was non-existent, reduced to a few feet of swirling, suffocating white. The concept of a reconnaissance mission was a grotesque joke. This was pure survival. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face, lowered his head against the wind, and began to trudge forward, relying on his compass and his ingrained soldier's instinct to maintain some semblance of direction towards the ridge Davis had indicated. Every step was a struggle. The snow was already knee-deep, drifting higher in the hollows. The cold was brutal, seeping through his layers of wool and canvas, numbing his feet, his hands, his very will to move. He pushed on, driven by a stubborn refusal to simply lie down and let the storm, or Davis, win. He thought of his family back home, of the future he had dreamed of the injustice he had tried to expose. He focused on putting one heavy boot in front of the other, a slow, agonizing rhythm against the roaring chaos of the blizzard. He had been struggling through the whiteout for perhaps 30 minutes, though time had lost all meaning, when he sensed, more than saw, a presence behind him. He stopped, straining to listen over the howl of the wind. Nothing, just the storm. He dismissed it as paranoia, his exhausted mind playing tricks on him. He took another step, and then he heard it. A sound that was not the wind, not the snow. A sharp, distinct crack, muffled by the thick falling snow, but unmistakable. It was followed instantly by a searing, white-hot impact in his upper back, near his spine. The force of it threw him forward, face down into a deep snowdrift. He gasped, but the air wouldn't come. A profound, shocking numbness spread rapidly through his limbs. He tried to push himself up, but his arms wouldn't respond. He could only lie there, his face pressed into the freezing snow, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He didn't see the figure that emerged from the swirling white behind him, a figure also clad in army winter gear, pistol drawn. He didn't see Lieutenant Davis approach, his face obscured by a scarf and goggles, his expression cold, calculating. Davis nudged Hayes's body with his boot. No response. He knelt, checking for a pulse, finding only the faint, fading flutter of a life escaping. Satisfied, Davis stood up. He looked around, ensuring he was alone in the vast, indifferent whiteout. The blizzard was the perfect accomplice, erasing footprints, muffling sounds, providing the ultimate cover. He performed one final act of meticulous stagecraft. He retrieved Hayes's rifle, which had fallen beside him in the snow. He fired a single round into the air, away from Hayes's body, the sound instantly swallowed by the storm. He then placed the rifle back near Hayes's outstretched hand, arranging the scene to suggest Hayes had perhaps fired at an unseen enemy or accidentally discharged his weapon before succumbing to the elements. Then, Lieutenant Davis turned and began the long, treacherous journey back to the command post, leaving Corporal Marcus Hayes alone in the snow, his body already beginning to disappear under the rapidly accumulating drifts. The perfect crime. A fatal encounter disguised as a casualty of war, witnessed by no one, its secret kept safe by the howling, impartial fury of the mountain storm. Lieutenant Davis returned to the command post hours later, covered in snow, his face a mask of weary, stoic grief. He reported the tragic, unavoidable news. Corporal Marcus Hayes, despite his bravery and determination, had been lost to the blizzard during his vital reconnaissance mission. A thorough search, Davis claimed, conducted as soon as the storm began to break, had yielded no trace. He was officially declared killed in action. The narrative was crafted with meticulous, self-serving care. Davis wrote a glowing, if brief, commendation for Hayes's file, praising his unflinching courage and dedication to duty in undertaking the perilous mission. He recommended Hayes for a posthumous medal for heroism. This served two purposes. It cemented the official story of Hayes's tragic but noble end, and it deflected any potential questions about the wisdom or recklessness of sending a lone soldier out in such conditions. Back in Birmingham, Alabama, the Hayes family received the dreaded telegram, followed weeks later by a small, impersonal package containing a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a neatly folded American flag. They grieved the loss of their son, their brother, their bright, scholarly young man, clinging to the official story of his heroic sacrifice. But Marcus's mother, and later his wife, whom he had married just before deploying, always harbored a small, persistent kernel of doubt. Marcus was careful. He was smart. The story of him getting lost in a storm, even a bad one, never quite sat right. but in the face of official commendations and military certainty, their quiet unease was just that, quiet. For Lieutenant Davis, the war continued. He served out his tour, earning further promotions, his record burnished by his leadership during the brutal Italian campaign. He returned home a decorated hero, Captain Davis now, his minor transgressions involving supply mismanagement, if ever noted, conveniently lost in the fog of war and the glow of victory. He leveraged his war record and his family connections into a successful business career, becoming a respected pillar of his community, a man whose quiet, authoritative presence commanded respect. He married, had children, then grandchildren. He lived a long, prosperous, and utterly untroubled life, the secret of what truly happened on that frozen mountainside buried deeper and deeper with each passing year. Meanwhile, Marcus Hayes's legacy existed only in the stories told by his family, in the medals kept in a dusty box, and in the quiet, lingering questions held by his widow. His son, Ben, born just months after his father shipped out, grew up without knowing him, hearing only the official tale of the war hero lost in the snow. But Ben inherited his father's sharp, inquisitive mind. As he grew older, as he pursued his own academic career in military history, the official story of his grandfather's death began to feel thin, incomplete. He noticed the inconsistencies, the lack of specific details in the official report, the vague, almost generic language of the commendations. His grandmother's quiet, lifelong skepticism resonated with his own historian's instinct for questioning official narratives. The heroic sacrifice felt too neat, too clean, for the messy, brutal reality of war, especially for a black soldier in a segregated unit known for facing disproportionate risks. The hero's narrative held for 50 years, but for Ben Hayes, it was a story with too many missing pages. For half a century, the glacier high in the Italian Alps held its secret, a silent, frozen tomb preserving a single, tragic moment from the Second World War. Corporal Marcus Hayes lay suspended in the ice, untouched by time, his body a perfect, chilling relic of a long-forgotten conflict. But the earth, like history itself, is not static. In the summer of 1994, an unusually long and intense heatwave settled over Europe. The ancient rivers of ice began to weep, receding at an unprecedented rate, revealing landscapes and secrets that had been locked away for generations. On a steep, rocky slope near the edge of one such receding glacier, an elderly Italian farmer named Giovanni was searching for 2 sheep that had strayed from his flock. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of these mountains, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and wind. He knew the rhythms of the seasons, the slow, imperceptible shifts of the ice. But he had never seen a melt like this. The glacier, which had loomed over his family's pastures for centuries, looked wounded, diminished, its icy snout pulled back further than he could ever remember. As he scanned the newly exposed terrain, a jumble of gray rock, glacial silt, and patches of hardy alpine grass, his eyes caught something out of place. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a sheep. It was a shape, partially embedded in the melting ice, unnaturally straight, unnaturally dark, against the pale landscape. Curiosity piqued. Giovanni climbed cautiously towards it. As he got closer, his heart began to pound. It was the sleeve of a uniform, a dark, woolen material, impossibly preserved. He knelt beside it, his old, calloused hands reaching out tentatively. He began to scrape away the slushy, melting ice around the shape. First, an arm emerged, then a shoulder, then the outline of a torso. He was looking at a soldier from the war, the guerra, that his own father had fought in. The uniform was unfamiliar, American, perhaps, but it was perfectly intact, the wool barely frayed. And the body itself. Giovanni crossed himself, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't a skeleton. It wasn't decomposed. It looked asleep. The skin was pale, almost translucent, but intact. The features were perfectly preserved, frozen in a final, peaceful expression. It was as if the man had simply laid down in the snow 50 years ago and closed his eyes. Giovanni stumbled back, his mind reeling. He knew he had found something extraordinary, something sacred, something that belonged not to the mountain, but to history. He marked the spot with a pile of stones and hurried back down the slope, his heart pounding, to alert the authorities in the nearest village. The ice, after 50 long years of silent stewardship, had finally, gently, given up its secret. Corporal Marcus Hayes was coming home. The discovery of the ice soldier, as the Italian media quickly dubbed him, sparked immediate international interest. The remarkably preserved body was carefully extricated from the glacier by a team of alpine rescue specialists and transported to a regional forensic institute in Bolzano. The initial examination confirmed he was an American soldier from the World War II era. Identifying him, however, required contacting the U.S. Army's Central Identification Laboratory. Working with the detailed records kept by the Army Graves Registration Service and cross-referencing them with units known to have fought in that specific sector of the Alps, the identification process was surprisingly swift. The dog tags, still around the soldier's neck, were corroded but partially legible. Dental records, flown in from the U.S. Archives, provided the definitive match. The soldier was Corporal Marcus Hayes, 92nd Infantry Division, officially declared killed in action on November 12, 1944. The notification reached Dr. Ben Hayes, Marcus's grandson, via a formal, slightly stilted phone call from an Army Casualty Affairs officer. Ben, now a 45-year-old associate professor of military history at Emory University in Atlanta, listened to the news in stunned silence. His grandfather, the man he had only known through faded photographs and the conflicting narratives of heroic sacrifice and quiet family doubt, had been found. Not just remains, but him, perfectly preserved, a literal time capsule emerging from the ice. The Army offered to handle the repatriation of the remains, but Ben knew, with an absolute certainty, that he had to go himself. This was more than just reclaiming a relative. It was the culmination of a lifetime of academic curiosity and personal longing. The unanswered questions surrounding his grandfather's death, the inconsistencies in the official story that had always gnawed at him, suddenly felt urgent, immediate. He had to see him. He had to know. He booked the first available flight to Milan, then took a series of trains and buses high into the breathtaking, imposing landscape of the Italian Alps. The journey felt surreal, a pilgrimage into the heart of his own family's defining mystery. He arrived at the Forensic Institute in Bolzano, a modern, sterile building that felt jarringly out of place amidst the ancient mountains. He was met by the chief coroner, Dr. Rossi, a man with kind eyes and a respectful, professional demeanor. Dr. Rossi led him to a small, private viewing room. Ben's heart pounded as he approached the stainless steel table. His grandfather lay there, still partially encased in a block of clear ice, his features perfectly, peacefully, preserved. It was like looking at a photograph come to life. He saw the face he knew from his grandmother's mantelpiece, the strong jawline, the thoughtful brow. It was him. After 50 years, Marcus Hayes was no longer just a name in a file, a ghost in a family story. He was real. Ben reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the cold, hard surface of the ice, a barrier 50 years thick separating him from the grandfather he had never known, but whose story he was finally about to learn. Dr. Ben Hayes spent several hours in the viewing room, a silent, emotional vigil with the grandfather he had only just met. He studied every detail of the preserved face, the uniform, the sense of profound, frozen stillness. He was a historian confronting the past in the most visceral, tangible way imaginable. Later, he met again with Dr. Rossi, the coroner, in his small, cluttered office, ready to discuss the official findings and the arrangements for repatriation. Dr. Rossi offered his condolences, expressing his professional awe at the state of preservation. "It is truly remarkable, Dr. Hayes," he said, using the respectful Italian term for a doctor or scholar. "The glacier, it is a perfect time capsule. Your grandfather, he appears almost as he did the day he was lost." Ben nodded, still processing the surreal experience. "The official report said he was killed in action, lost in a blizzard. I assume the findings are consistent with exposure, hypothermia?" Dr. Rossi paused, his kind eyes suddenly grave. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Dottore," he began, his voice dropping slightly. The cold. It preserved him. But it is not what brought about his end. Ben felt a cold prickle of apprehension. What do you mean? During our preliminary external examination, Dr. Rossi continued, leaning forward. Before we began the full autopsy, we noted something anomalous. An injury. On his upper back, near the right shoulder blade, partially obscured by the uniform. He slid a glossy photograph across the desk. It was a close-up of the area he described. Even with the ice partially obscuring it, Ben could see it clearly. A small, almost perfectly circular disruption in the fabric of the heavy wool uniform, the edges slightly darkened, frayed. At first, we thought perhaps it was damage from the ice or from the excavation, Dr. Rossi said. But upon closer examination, the pattern is consistent with a point of entry. A small one, high velocity. Ben stared at the photograph, his mind racing, trying to reconcile this image with the story he had been told his entire life, heroically lost in a storm. And then, Dr. Rossi continued, his voice barely a whisper, when we conducted the initial X-rays to assess the internal preservation, he slid another photograph across the desk. It was an X-ray image of his grandfather's torso, and there, clearly visible, nestled against the bone of the spine, was a small, dense, metallic object. He did not freeze to death, Dr. Rossi said, his gaze meeting Ben's with a profound, somber significance. He was wounded, fatally, most likely, from behind. The room seemed to spin. The official narrative, the story of heroic sacrifice that had defined his family for 50 years, shattered in an instant, killed in action, lost in a blizzard. It was all a lie. His grandfather hadn't just died in the war. He had been the victim of a violent act, shot in the back, his fate concealed by the storm and buried by 50 years of official history. The quiet doubts his grandmother had always held, the inconsistencies Ben himself had sensed, they weren't just suspicions anymore. They were the preface to a dark, hidden truth. A truth that had been frozen in time, waiting for the ice to finally give it up. The revelation that his grandfather had met a violent end, and that the official story was a lie, transformed Ben Hayes from a grieving historian into a determined investigator. He stayed in Italy, working closely with Dr. Rossi and the forensic team as they conducted the full, meticulous examination of Corporal Marcus Hayes's remains and effects. The thawing process was slow, deliberate. Each layer of ice carefully melted away to reveal the perfectly preserved artifacts beneath. His uniform, his boots, his standard issue equipment, all were intact, offering a poignant, tangible connection to the past. But the most significant discovery came from within his field jacket. Tucked deep inside an inner pocket, sealed within a remarkably well-preserved, waterproof oilcloth pouch, was his grandfather's journal. Ben's hands trembled as Dr. Rossi handed him the small, leather-bound book. It was stiff with cold, the pages slightly warped, but miraculously, the ink was still legible. He retreated to a quiet corner of the lab, the weight of history palpable in his hands, and began to read. He started from the beginning, immersing himself in his grandfather's world, the daily struggles of life on the front lines, the camaraderie among the black soldiers, the casual stinging racism they faced, his longing for home, his hopes for the future. It was an intimate, heartbreaking portrait of the young man Ben had never known. Then, he reached the final entries, written in the days leading up to November 12th, 1944. The tone shifted, becoming urgent, fearful. He read his grandfather's methodical documentation of the missing medical supplies, his dawning suspicion of Lieutenant Davis. He read the account of the tense, explosive confrontation in Davis's tent, the lieutenant's racist fury, the explicit threat. And finally, he reached the last entry, the one written just hours before his grandfather walked out into the blizzard. Ben read the words, his own breath catching in his throat, tears blurring his vision. He knows I have the proof. He just ordered me on a solo patrol, deep into enemy territory, into the teeth of this blizzard. This isn't a mission, it's a trap. It was a voice from the ice, a 50-year-old cry from the grave, laying bare the entire conspiracy. The journal was the irrefutable proof, the motive, the timeline, the accusation, all in his grandfather's own hand. The forensic evidence provided the final, damning pieces. The object, extracted from near his grandfather's spine, was confirmed by U.S. Army ballistics experts to be a .45 caliber projectile, consistent with the standard issue M1911 pistol carried by American officers during World War II, including Lieutenant Davis. The location of the entry wound, high on the back, angled slightly downward, confirmed he had been wounded from behind, execution style. Ben now held the complete, horrifying truth. His grandfather hadn't been killed in action. He had been eliminated by his own commanding officer, a racially motivated act to cover up Davis's crimes. The blizzard hadn't been the cause of death. It had been the perfect accomplice, the perfect cover story. The medals, the commendations, the 50 years of heroic narrative, it was all a monstrous lie, built on the foundation of a murder conveniently buried by snow and silence. The voice from the ice had finally spoken, and it demanded a reckoning. Dr. Ben Hayes returned to the United States not just with his grandfather's remains, but with a heavy, explosive truth. He carried the 50-year-old journal, the official Italian coroner's report, and the U.S. Army's own ballistics analysis of the projectile removed from Corporal Hayes's spine. He had the complete, undeniable proof of a 50-year-old crime and its subsequent cover-up. His first act was to provide his grandfather with the burial he had been denied for half a century. Corporal Marcus Hayes was laid to rest with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery, his headstone finally reflecting the truth of his service and sacrifice. The date of death corrected, the narrative reclaimed. It was a somber, emotional ceremony, attended by Ben, his family, and representatives from military historical associations, a small measure of dignity finally restored. But Ben knew that true justice required more than a proper burial. It required accountability. He presented his evidence to the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID. The findings triggered a high-level, internal investigation. The Army, faced with irrefutable proof of a murder and cover-up involving one of its own officers, a man lauded as a war hero, was forced to confront a dark chapter of its own history. The investigation quickly identified Lieutenant Davis, now retired Captain Paul Davis, living comfortably in an upscale retirement community in Florida. At 90 years old, he was frail, his memory perhaps clouded by age, but he was alive. He was the last living link to the crime. Ben Hayes knew he had to confront the man who had taken his grandfather's life and condemned his family to 50 years of a lie. He traveled to the quiet, sun-drenched retirement home, the 50-year-old journal clutched in his hand like a talisman. He found Davis sitting in a wheelchair on a shaded veranda, a thin, white-haired man with pale, watery eyes that held no flicker of recognition. Ben introduced himself, calmly, evenly. "Captain Davis? My name is Dr. Ben Hayes. I'm Corporal Marcus Hayes's grandson." A faint shadow passed over the old man's face. Confusion? Or a flicker of a long-buried memory? Ben didn't wait for a response. He opened the journal, its pages brittle with age, and began to read his grandfather's final entry, his voice steady, unwavering, letting the words, written 50 years ago in a frozen dugout, hang in the warm Florida air. "He knows I have the proof. This isn't a mission. It's a trap." He finished reading and looked directly into Davis's eyes. The old man's face was pale, his breathing shallow. He said nothing. There was no confession, no denial, no flicker of remorse, only a vast, empty silence. The official reckoning was anticlimactic. Given Davis's age, his failing health, and the 50-year gap, the Army and the Justice Department decided against pursuing a formal prosecution, a decision that enraged Ben but did not surprise him. Instead, the Army quietly stripped Davis of his medals and commendations, erasing his name from the official rolls of honor. It was a bureaucratic correction, not true justice. But Ben Hayes had achieved something more profound. He had reclaimed his grandfather's story. He published his findings, collaborating with historians to ensure the truth of Corporal Marcus Hayes's life and his dark fate became part of the official record of the 92nd Infantry Division. and the broader history of the African-American experience in World War II. He had brought his grandfather home, not just physically, but historically, ensuring that his voice, silenced for so long in the ice, would finally and forever be heard. The reckoning was incomplete, but the truth, at long last, was free.